So when you hear about global warming, and then maybe you think about Alaska or coming to Alaska, what are some thoughts you might have about it? Like, what's the one thing that pops in your head when you think of Alaska or climate change? Or
we were at Exit Glacier, I think 2 days ago.
Okay.
So walking through and seeing the signposts and how the progression was spaced out, it seems to be accelerating, although I don't have measurements. So it was just kind of a shame we're up there climbing and recognizing that it's kind of going away. So it's kind of sobering.
In the last year, because of the low snow year that you guys had up here, that the glacier really has retreated a lot just in the past year.
It has. So we're seeing that with the glacier we visited today too.
Right.
So they naturally fall into the ocean all the time.
Yeah.
But as they retreat back, we also lose mass. So they may have talked about that at Exit Glacier, where the top of the glacier actually shrinks. And the glaciers may not look like much, it might just like a big block of ice, but they're actually an engine for the environment around them, providing fresh water, providing nutrients, and so the less there are, the less likely we are to have life around it. So, and of course, the cause of climate change, we're one of the causes of climate change. Probably the major factor is the amount of carbon we're putting into the air and other atmospheric gases, of course, to warm things up. And the other thing people think about when they think of Alaska is oil. We have a lot of it up there. And so as the Arctic changes, when we're having melting ice here, we're obviously melting in the Arctic too, and that's opening up the opportunity for more oil exploration. So have you guys ever heard of exploration in the Arctic for that? Or the potential, of course, is for a spill.
Yeah.
And so when you guys think oil spills, what's the first thing that kind of comes to your mind?
Well, obviously, I'm from the age, the Exxon Valdez was the first one I heard about, and then more recently the BP in New Orleans. So, I mean, we hear a lot more about fracking now because we're in the lower 48. So I think, to me, I think about it as a bridge, right? There's got to be a way to get to a better way of reducing our reliance on carbon, but in the meantime, we have to survive, right? So what's the most safe way to do that, most economical, so we keep people working? And it's got to be balanced. It can't be all or none. So, yeah.
And I think when we look at that balance is what kind of decisions are we making as consumers versus what we ask our decision makers or politicians to choose for us. And so having that balance, and you're right, you guys are in the Marcellus Shale, right, in that area. So how has that changed the local?
Hasn't impacted, well, it's helped upstate New York a bit. That was an area that was economically depressed for the last probably 40 years. So it's helped that a bit. It's helped parts of Pennsylvania. So far there hasn't, to my knowledge, been any huge issues, but there's a lot of unknowns. So I think, we have to rely on the science. So you have to actually you have to do it the right way, do the research, let the science teach you. There are folks who don't want to, I think there are alarmists on both sides. There are people who say, what's the worry, right? There are other people who don't want the science to advance because they're worried about what the science may tell them. So you have to let the science lead you, where it takes you. And I have, a lot of confidence in scientists that they'll do things systematically. And it goes back to global warming. We know the globe is warming, right? There was an ice age how many years ago? We learned that today on a cruise. So there's a trend toward warming, but my common sense tells me from what I've seen, we're accelerating that trend. So you have to let the science establish, help you establish an understanding. Now, we don't have a huge trend line since we've had only industrialization for the last 200 years or so, and we haven't kept records, but it's kind of hard to deny, right? So.
I'm curious, so you're from New Jersey. What's your background? Like, what do you do for a living?
I'm in the finance industry, so I work as for a consulting firm that helps financial institutions.
I'm a student at the University of Southern California.
Oh, very nice. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say that your attitude towards science is quite refreshing. It is not one. Yeah, it is not one that you run across a lot. So when we're talking about energy use,
right.
And I think you guys have a firm grasp kind of on what our energy cycle is. But where do you think are places that the United States can improve, maintaining that level of comfort that we have? We like our lifestyle, of course, and we want to see economic development, especially in depressed areas like upstate New York. But what are some of the, you think, good choices that we can make when it comes to energy use and that?
I mean, clearly solar has got to have, but it just hasn't been cost effective yet, but at some point it will, right? Hopefully, we can continue to be better at that. We've seen incentives. I mean, even for different parts of even my sister lives in Massachusetts. They put solar in because they had some incentives which help. Whether they can exist without subsidies at some point, I think we'll get to that. The other thing that I think about is water use out west. At some point, desalination is going to probably have to pay for itself. Right now it doesn't, but you look at California, the population there, they can't just keep taking from the Colorado. At some point, it's going to be too much.
So in Monterey, we've been having a water shortage for over 10 years, and desalination is something that's being actively discussed by Cal-Am Water, which is our water company, and it's pretty controversial. Although there's improvements in the technology, and there's been it's back and forth in the legislature right now whether or not they're going to move forward with that. I'm curious, talking about water, Southern California, we've had the fires in San Diego earlier this year. Are you being impacted at all?
Not really. I remember one day I woke up and outside there was a lot of fog, like smog, all over LA. You couldn't really see that far. It was cool until you realized what it was. I didn't realize at first, and then once I knew it was from like a fire, then it wasn't as pretty anymore. But that's really the only time I was ever impacted by it. But we have family in San Diego who have definitely been in it around the fires. So.
Absolutely, yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Have you guys estimated how long until the glaciers are gone?
That's a good question, and it depends on where we're talking. So places that get a lot of rainfall like here, our glaciers are going to be around a very long time. The fed from the Harding ice field just over the mountains there, and the amount of snow that it gets is going to continue to grow those glaciers. Now, they are retreating faster than they're growing, as most glaciers around the world are. But for the long term, they're going to be here for a lot longer than, say, glaciers in Montana at the famous Glacier National Park. Probably by the mid part of this century, there will be no glaciers left in northern Montana in the mountains. And maybe more alarming is in the Arctic Ocean. We're seeing the sea ice because it freezes every winter, and it probably will continue to do that for maybe a couple 100,000 years. But in the winter time is when it will freeze, and then it melts back in the summer, and there's always a little bit of ice left over. But we're seeing that shrinkage kind of pull up every year, closer and closer to the North Pole. And that means it's pulling farther and farther offshore. And so there's some estimates that by 2030, the Arctic can be completely ice-free in the summer. So not a big deal, you think, because it's going to freeze again this winter. But if you think about ice over time, it just gets thicker and thicker. And so that sea ice that's still up there now might be several dozen to a couple decades old. But if it melts all in the summer, then in the wintertime we're going to have much thinner ice. It's, the term we use is called kuliak. It's the Yupik word for young sea ice. And so animals that rely on it won't have that nice thick ice pack. And that opens up the opportunity for a lot more development, though. When the ice is gone, then we can ship through there. So,
what about the impact on the sea level, though? Because we live, not too far from Manhattan, so we had the Hurricane Sandy, where basically this was like the Netherlands almost, right? We were flooded. So, isn't that the real issue with the polar ice caps melting, the sea level, the rise in sea level, or that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So, with warming oceans, one of the reasons the sea ice is melting faster than the glaciers is because the land under the glaciers is still cold from the glacier itself. But in the ocean water is warming, so it's the air above the sea ice that's warming, it's the ocean under the sea ice that's warming, so it's getting melted from both places. So another factor of warming water is that it gets bigger. So if you think about, like, if you're slow dancing, you can have a lot of couples on the dance floor, but if you're dancing quickly, you're all bumping into each other, and so people spread out. Well, same with molecules. The more molecules have energy, the hotter they are, the more they move around, so they expand. And so it's addition of water into the ocean. Now, the sea ice was already floating on the water, so that's not going to increase the sea levels. It's the land-based ice. So it's those glaciers in Montana, the glaciers here, like we just saw the Holgate Glacier that we saw today. It's the melting of that. So as Jeff said, they're retreating or melting faster than they're growing. So it's the addition of that water, and then the fact that as that water gets warmer, it expands, that's causing the rapid sea level rise we're seeing. And we estimate that by 2050, we'll probably see maybe up to a meter, so up to 3 feet of sea level rise. And how that impacts different areas is going to depend on how far above sea level they are. And it's also going to depend on storms. So like what happened with Sandy is it was the storm surge that came in that was more than the city was prepared to deal with.
Think about sea ice this way. So if you have a glass of water and you have ice in it already, when that ice melts, your water doesn't come out because it's displacing as much as it will be. But if you have that same glass of water and then you add an ice cube to it, then it'll overflow. And so you can think of that addition of ice as being the ice that's on the land, it's in your hand, and the ice that's in the glass is what's already frozen on the ocean. So, the hand on our planet is Greenland and Antarctica, and that's where the majority of the land-based ice is. And as that continues to melt, that then raises sea levels. So a little analogy to think about, but again, if the way Sarah May is thinking about it, if you take that same glass of ice that's got ice cubes in it already, but then you warm it up, now you've expanded it, so you have that tea kettle effect where it's got to go somewhere. Yeah, great, good question. That's a really good question. Yeah.
It's a really good question. I mean, we've seen a lot of cool stuff today, and I'm sure I was up at Denali earlier in my Alaska trip, and it was raining up there, and they were saying that everything's a little weird. Like the moose are already starting to herd up for the rut, which is several weeks earlier than normal. So we're seeing that animals are changing their behavior in response to the changing, conditions out there. Have you guys, fires and the storms, is there something that like you remember from when you were younger, or something that used to happen that's different now than it used to be?
Well, I'm older than she is by a few years. No, because in the Northeast we always had very erratic winters. You could have winter, we'd have a bunch of snow, and others when there wasn't much. And it's still kind of like the same right now. So I can't think of anything temperature-wise. I can't say I feel that it's hotter. Again, we're dealing with long cycles here, right? So I haven't noticed it's mostly what I hear about. Is it true they can measure the hole in the Arctic, the ozone layer? And again, is the science that good where they can actually, measure it and see how it progresses?
So I'm sensing we may be in the same age bracket, and so when we were younger, when we were your age, the ozone layer hole was the big thing. It was gonna kill us all, and while it is shrinking, it didn't go away. There is still that one, and there is one over the Arctic as well. And it does increase temperatures some because there is less atmosphere there. But again, that is caused by the chemicals that we're putting in the atmosphere, breaking down other molecules that are up there. So yeah, it's a pretty precise science. They're able to measure those distances. So I think you mentioned your affinity for science earlier. I appreciate that. One of the things that I think it's difficult to communicate is that science is all about doubt. We're a profession of skeptics, and so we prove things by saying really, and so then we make scientists prove it and publish their papers.
If we prove it, we're dead, right? Is that where you're going?
Maybe, but by proving it, we're never going to be 100% sure of anything because that's the way we are. But when the majority of the work is overwhelmingly leaning towards one direction, then we can say with really high certainty that that's the way it's going. And so when it comes to ozone or overall climate, we're pretty good at measuring that. And we've been doing it for long enough now that we think we can spot some trends. Even though you're right, we're talking about very long cycles. And of course, we haven't been measuring for hundreds of years. But at least over the last 70 years or so, we've got pretty good data on how much the chemicals that are in the air. So yeah, I'm confident. I feel comfortable. Yeah.
There was actually this week in the Senate, there was some interesting information that was put out there. And one of the senators said, NASA is one of the groups doing this science. And NASA, we trust them to send a minivan-sized spaceship to Mars, land it successfully, and then gather all the data from there. So we're like, cool, NASA can do that. Well, NASA's like looking at our planet too, and we're a lot closer than Mars. So when they're throwing satellites up there, I mean, they can measure everything from the sea surface temperature to the amount of chlorophyll or the green pigment in the ocean. We can tell the productivity when there's extra life. We can, we trust weather forecasts. When they say there's a hurricane coming, get out of the way, we get out of the way. So it kind of, by extension, if they're saying there's change coming, we need to prepare, it kind of makes sense to trust that they know what they're talking about. So that kind of came up in the Senate this week, and I was like, yeah, you go, senators. You know what you're talking about, too. Megan, you're...
What are we moving towards? You're saying we need change. What change are you talking about, I guess?
So, so there's 7 billion people on the planet. And, 60, 70 years ago, there was 1 billion. So in a few decades, we've increased the population of the planet hugely. Unfortunately, society is really based on, what 60, 70 years ago was based on what we could do with 1 billion people. So how we use resources, really, we need to look at that because we only have one planet. We've never discovered another habitable planet. This is where all our food is. It's where all of our energy is. It's where, we reproduce, we live out our lives. So, when we're looking at things like trees, we know it takes a certain amount of time for trees to grow. So if you're going to cut some down to build a house, you need to plant some more. So the next generation, when they're grown and need to build a house, they can do the same. Well, with things like fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, those are created like 300, 500 million years ago by trees that died, were buried under rock, smushed into this really dense fuel. But that process isn't going on anymore. It takes about 30 million years to create coal. And, we can't wait 30 million years for the next kind of round of coal to be produced. So we've got energy right now. I mean, it's sunny. We feel the heat from the sun. You mentioned solar earlier. We get more energy coming from the sun every day than any other single energy source on the planet. We just need to be better at taking that and using it. And interestingly, it comes down to there was a debate between Tesla and Edison about alternating current versus direct current. And alternating current was safer at the time because you couldn't die from electrocution the same way you could from direct. But direct current, if we kind of change some of our power lines and our power stations, we can really utilize solar in a different way than alternating current. So when I say change, some of it's us changing our minds. It's us saying, okay, we did it that way and it worked really well. Let's try something new that probably will work just as well. It just might take a little time to get it up and running.
I mean, you mentioned coal, right? The issue is not that we'll run through our supply of coal, it's that we'll produce so much greenhouse gas, carbon emissions, that will just bake the planet or whatever, right? So it's because we found shale and technology gets better, you better extract more and more coal. But I think about, to me, and this is where it gets very political, right? So the automobile is our way of life, right? But it's not us. Think about it in China and India, right? They have people, the rising economies, if they all drive cars, 2 cars per family like we do, but it's tough to tell them you shouldn't do that, right? We have ours, so it's got to be better technology, right? You have to go cleaner technology, but it's got to find a way to make that attractive because they're not as affluent as we are. We can probably get to the point where we can, be mostly hybrids, right? Cars, but for them, how do you convince them to do that?
Sarah and I were talking earlier how, we went from 1 billion to 7 billion, and we didn't do that by accident. We're healthier now than we've ever been. Disease is less. People are living longer. We've raised the standard of living for millions of people around the world so that we can have these higher populations. But we did that because we're smart. We're clever animals. And so I think the change is going to be we have to be clever again. And you're right, it's really hard to point your finger and say, no, don't do that, because we already did.
Yeah, exactly.
And we wouldn't want to do that either. We're humanitarians. We want to see everyone succeed and be healthy and happy. So maybe the change that we talk about and everyone talks about can be, again, the way we change our minds to help come up with better solutions to still raise their standard of living and raise them out of the developing world into the developed world. But you're right. We're probably not ever going to burn all the coal that is here, but we shouldn't burn all the coal that is here. Right. Yeah, that's a good question.
China, people walk around with with gas masks on, right?
What's the price of,
Yeah.
what's the price of advancing if that's what you've got to live in? So, yeah, great.
Did that answer your question, or was that a slightly different question you were asking?
No, it was good. I was listening. I was just, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we can look at and say, sure, let's do solar, but you're right, it doesn't pay for itself yet. And sure, let's do wind power, but when we talk about the change, again, it's changing our minds, changing our attitudes to realizing that the one source we've been going to all the time, we might now have to look at 6 or 7 different sources to maintain the same level. And that has to do with not just sources, but efficiencies. So,
We're about maybe around the same age. I bet I'm probably older, but when we were growing up, no one recycled, right? Didn't exist, right? So it's there's hope for us, hopefully.
I think too what you just said, hope is an important thing. Like opportunity is the other thing I think about. Is when we discovered America, it was like, wow, this land of opportunity, all these new resources. We don't really have any more land to discover, but I think that we have like maybe new ways of thinking to discover. So there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth. We used to be a really service-based economy, and we turned into a much more kind of item or commodity-based economy. And I think if we kind of start to turn back a little more to a service-based economy, more people, more jobs, it's looking for those opportunities. Where can we find them?
well, I don't want to take up any more of your vacation, but we appreciate you guys coming and talking to us for a few minutes. Yeah, it was very helpful.
It was very helpful. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, don't forget your cookies.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Enjoy Denali. I hope the mountain's out for you.
Oh, yeah. I was up there this last weekend. It was great.